thank you for joining me today on Rivers of Living Water. I'm Janet Cassidy, and I've invited Deacon Art Miller back to talk. This is kind of part two. You'll notice that we had a previous conversation about Emmett Till, someone that Deacon Art's family knew that was brutally murdered in the South. And that puts us in a place to talk more about the civil rights movement. So I want to begin with there. So welcome back, Deacon Art.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to
Always
have
a
you with
pleasure,
us.
Janet.
Thank you. I enjoyed visiting with you. I think we could talk for hours, but
Indeed.
so because I'm of that age where I get the AARP bulletin, uh, there was a story in there about the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement.
Mm,
And it had a picture of a woman who just kind of almost accidentally fell into this job of being a secretary for Dr. Martin Luther King. And he took her on trips and all of that. And so it talked about letter from Birmingham Jail. And it just really caught my attention. I
mm.
was just fascinated with it. So I kind of want to get into that today because I think we've got some good stuff we can talk about. Now,
Oh, absolutely.
for people that don't know, he was called Dr. Martin Luther King because he was a doctor of philosophy. And if
Yes.
you read this letter from Birmingham Jail, it it's there. He's prophetic in his writing. In the ARP bulletin, this woman said that Dr. King, this was 1962, and he was arrested because he didn't have a permit for a parade, but they wouldn't give him the permit because they didn't like his views. And he
Yeah.
was considered an outside agitator. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But when he wrote from jail, he was responding to these 8 white Christian ministers who were critical of him, calling him an outside agitator. And he would write on toilet paper and sandwich bags and newspapers, and his writings would come out of the jail by his lawyer secretly. And then in the article, it said they would put this together like a puzzle. Well, I was
Right.
shocked when I read it because it came out like 6 pages or something. I mean, it was really long. Um, so there are some things I want to talk about this. And any insights from you on this as we begin this conversation?
Sure. Many know of Dr. King's incredible prophetic and poetic um, verbiage and how he spoke, the lilt of his voice. But he was a brilliant man. He went to college at 15.
Oh,
To
I didn't know
Morehouse
that.
College, yes. And he received his PhD at Boston University, and which is a bastion of real academic prowess. His mentor there was another man from Morehouse by the name of Dr. Thomas. Oh gosh darn it. Um, I'll remember in a moment. So he was very brilliant, and he was able to pen this letter, as you'd indicated, on small pieces and strips of paper that his attorney was able to secret out. And as you said, they put it together in this profound response to 8 clergy. They were not all actually Christians. There was one head rabbi who was
Oh, okay.
amongst the
Yes.
group as
Yeah.
well,
Yep.
not to mention a Catholic adjutor, the Bishop of Birmingham, also included his name on a letter that talked about um, that he should leave, that Dr. King should not be in Alabama, that he should go back to where he was from, back to Georgia, because all he's doing is irritating what is a very calm and peaceful place. He was an outside agitator.
But he was invited to do this because he said
Of
we
course.
share our resources. We
Okay.
help each other out.
I know, but this is, and so what he did was pin that letter saying exactly what you did. that injustice, then that's where that came from. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And who he is actually quoting is, I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas, who
So.
said that an unjust law is not a moral law. And he quoted that
Yes.
coming
Yes.
from, and then there was a pope who also quoted at that same time about unjust laws are not in alliance with the moral law. And what do we follow? Christ said we follow the moral law,
And
not
that
the man.
it's
Yes,
still relevant today. And so when
yes,
people struggle with, well, that's the law and I have to do it, you really, if you look at it through his lens, and he talks about, like you said, just laws and unjust laws. And
yes.
what does he describe as a just law and an unjust
Mm,
law? You know,
yeah.
is it in line with God's moral code?
Yes. Does it lift human beings or does it diminish? As we had said in our first segment, Psalm 139 says, we're all beautifully and wonderfully made, formed in our mother's womb, knew us, and before we were put together and before there was thought. So all of us, every inch of God's great creation,
Mm,
is to be loved. And so that's the genesis, the boundaries, the foundation of Dr. King's letter, explaining that all of us should be in jail with him
yes.
against these unjust laws. By the way, his mentor was Howard Thurman, Dr.
Oh,
Howard Thurman,
okay.
um, who is on the same level as far as I'm concerned as Thomas Merton. Father
Yeah. Okay.
More, he is just a brilliant theologian, and became the first African American dean of any college that was not a black college. Howard Thurman
Oh,
also went to Morehouse. Howard Thurman also went to Morehouse with Dr. King's father.
oh, okay. Okay.
So
You know,
yeah,
I think that when you take people like Dr. King, there's something in their nature that I mean, this goes beyond just academic knowledge about the way we should behave and what we
yeah,
should do. There's something in you that cannot stop at that door of
yeah,
injustice and just say, well, I can't go through it.
yeah,
I'm stuck.
yeah, yeah. Oh, it is. It's there. There's what I refer to as the 11th commandment.
Oh
The
yeah,
11th commandment, yeah,
yeah,
thou shalt not be a bystander.
yeah,
There's this thing that lingers within that God plants, and we're the ones that have to adhere to that if we pay attention to that, which is within every single one of us. And I believe that seed is in every human being,
yeah.
because that's what calls us to community.
But
Yeah,
it gets pushed down because of our human fears, and we rationalize things, and it's like, well, I can't really do that. I can't make it. And so before you know it, that's tamped down
yeah,
when really it should be, it should make us passionate and,
yeah,
emblazon us to stand up and make
sure.
a difference.
I would suggest to you that in a thriving community, a beloved community, it is rampant, because that's what defines a beloved community: profound and absolute concern about your neighbor.
Yeah, yeah,
When
yeah.
you have, imagine a place
Mm,
where everything that causes you to be is through community.
mm.
um, it's that idea that Africans saying about umbuto, which is I am because you are.
Oh.
Yes. And if we live in a
Huh.
community, and I would share with you, that's where Emmett Till came from,
Mhm.
where it was community. It, it was before air conditioning. Now, I mention that because you couldn't, in the summer, you couldn't stay in the house.
Yeah,
You had to
yeah,
go outside. So everyone was outside.
yeah.
If we lived in that kind of environment, then the letter that the clergy wrote to Dr. King could not exist, Because see, a wrong is a wrong, no matter who sells you that.
Right. Do we have that letter? Because I didn't read the letter that they wrote.
Oh, yeah, yes, it's easily accessible.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, it's just if someone were to Google
Like
eight,
Call of
eight,
Unity.
yes, the eight clergy that wrote to Dr. King,
Okay.
it'll
But
come up. Yeah.
oddly, didn't they call themselves like their mission was the call to unity?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And what they were looking at was themselves. Remember, these were eight clergy of different denominations and faith traditions that rarely, during the 50s, people there was, I mean, it was just isolated. Pre-Vatican II, there was no idea of inclusion in terms of the common beliefs, all being children of Abraham.
Right,
Way
right, right,
before
right.
that. So I think they were talking about they were unified, but you're not. Look at us. Well, you can look at us and you could be on the wrong side of wrong side of history.
That's right. Well, let me talk to you a little bit. We know Martin Luther King's um thoughts about justice and injustice and laws, okay? But I want to step into a little bit different of a conversation, well, continuing really in this conversation. Some quotes that I read that just really hit me. He talked about how in um, the early Christians, when they went into a town, because of their strength and their beliefs, they were okay with disturbing the peace that was the power structure at the time.
Absolutely.
And,
Yes.
you know, they would call them disturbers of the peace and outside agitators.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Oh,
so
absolutely.
they were willing to suffer for it. And I- I- we've lost something. I mean, not everybody, because worldwide we
Sure.
know that Christians are being martyred and standing up for the faith. But in our ordinary communities, it feels like sometimes we're just willing to accept the status quo.
Oh,
That's the way it is. I can't do anything about it.
if the status quo is working for you, you tend to protect the status quo.
That's true.
And if the status quo isn't working for you,
Mhm.
somehow you rebel against it, either externally or internally. It's going to get exposed, and during this time it was so external that people could see all of these horrid things. And as we had said in the first segment, the beacon was pointed at this one little boy
Mhm.
who had come from a beloved community into this bastion of hatred,
Mhm.
and it was exposed. And at that point everyone had a common purpose,
Mhm.
and when you have a common purpose, it's easier to
Mhm.
go into that, just as the Christians did. And that's why he aligned himself, Dr. King, with those early Christians. They
Mhm.
had a common purpose, and one in which they were willing to die.
Yes. Yes. And we uh, ordinary people, sometimes I think we've just lost that passion for the truth and our recognition of the importance of sacrifice and suffering. I mean, think about it. We're in Lent, okay? And an awful lot of us say, well, boy, this is a real sacrifice. We're going to give up desserts for,
Mm.
40 days. What? Can you imagine
Yeah,
saying that to St. Paul? I'm sacrificing.
yeah.
Sacrificing.
The whole thing that's a funny thing about Lent, or the beautiful thing about Lent, the whole purpose of Lent, as was the purpose of those who went out to walk those, 40 miles, 40 days, 40 nights in the desert, as Elijah did, or the journey of Paul, or all of their journeys, all of it. And what the purpose of Lent is, so that we can draw closer to God. Because if you're not better going into Lent than you are coming out. If you're just the same, then all you did was give up chocolate.
Yeah, that's right.
The whole purpose of Lent, the whole purpose of the movement, the whole purpose of the apostles and every martyr after that was to draw closer to God and to bring others with them.
Well, the word I like to hang my hat on is transformation.
Yeah. Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
we transform our interior with the help of God's grace. We transform our communities. Transformation is key. I've got something
Oh,
else here I want to mention to you. This is 1962, and it's a little I don't know, it makes me shudder a little bit here. Dr. King says that things are different today, 1962, from the early days of the Christians, the contemporary church. Now, he's talking about church with a small c.
yeah.
We know as Catholics, capital C, we're referring to the Catholic Church. Small c means
Mhm.
we're talking about the universal church. He says that the contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. That's really disturbing to me. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo, which we talked about the status quo, far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure that we live under in the average community. We're consoled by the church because the church sanctions what's going on. So, in other words, we're not going into our communities, penetrating them, looking around like the prophets did and said, you might not want to be doing that because that's not good. The power structures in our communities, you know, political or whatever, they're comfortable with us
Mhm.
because we're not challenging anything in there. So he warns us that if we don't recapture what the early Christians had, their spirit, we're going to lose our authenticity. People are going to leave because we're not standing for anything. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
It's what two things. You had mentioned transformation. Our transformation never ends.
Yes.
It is a constant transformation. Our conversion is ongoing. That road that we seek to follow is the destination.
Yeah.
Our destination is to be on the journey.
Yes.
So it is. I hope I'm closer to God tomorrow than I am today. I hope I'm closer to God in my relationship with God after Lent than I was before Lent, and continue whatever I was doing. The other day, I had a conversation with a gentleman, and we are talking about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and visiting the sick. And he said, "Well, all my friends aren't sick anymore." And I said, "Well, there's still sick people out there."
Mm-hmm.
Even in our Confiteor, we talk about for the sins that of omission,
Mm-hmm.
for things I have not done.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, Matthew 25 tells us that when the master comes, he'll separate the sheep from the goats. The sheep, enter the place I provided for you, for one is hungry and naked and clothed. And they say, "When did we do that?" And he says, "When you did it for the least of mine, you did it for me."
Mm-hmm.
Then there, the other side that goes, he said, "Well, you're going into hell."
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Because you didn't do these things." Now, within that construct in Christ's parable in Matthew 25, he does not mention at all, "Because you believed in me." You
Mm-hmm.
see, we don't go to heaven because we believed in God. We go to heaven because what our belief in God causes us to act.
Mm-hmm.
It is
Yeah,
then our actions.
that part caught me with the what you didn't do, because I think any of us could write out a list of the things we haven't done, right?
There's sick people out there. You
Yeah.
may not know some, but there are a whole bunch of them.
And they might not only be physically ill, right?
They're ill in every aspect that you can imagine, but we have to be careful about making. Well, I visited my aunt who's a little bit nuts, so she's sick. Now, let's just stick with there's some people lying up in some old folks' homes that you could just go over and read a book.
Yes.
Or, they're hungry. And so, well, I wrote a check. No, you can do a little bit more than that. I
Yes.
mean, it is God calls us to action. What is it in Micah 6? It says, um, love mercy, do justice.
Do
It doesn't
justice.
say sit there and admire justice and
Yes.
walk humbly with thy God. We
Yes.
are to do, we are to act, we are to be. I have an aunt who's 110 years old. 110. She just wrote her first book last year.
What? She did? Oh,
Yes.
wow.
And she's still active, feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. So, I mean, you can do some stuff.
Yeah, definitely,
Now,
definitely.
not everybody is my Aunt Edith. I know that. And
Yeah.
there are people who need to be fed. There are those who are sick. And even in those moments, I will share with you, as a deacon, I've visited many people who are sick, who are on their deathbeds. I've seen people who are about to die minister to more people than anyone else because
Mhm,
they're the ones that are calling them to
mhm,
peace. See,
mhm.
God can use you wherever you are in whatever circumstances you find yourself. If you're in the middle of a mess, God will send you a message in the mess. He
Mhm.
will bring you could be just an example of strength. I remember there was a woman in my church by the name of Miss Betty. Miss Betty had a horribly painful back. She always sat in the back of the church in her walker seat thing. And we used to have a healing mass, and I would pray over her, and she asked me, Deacon, why doesn't God heal my back? I said, Miss Betty, don't you know every time you come up for communion, because she used to come up for communion,
Yeah,
everybody is sitting there watching you, saying, I wish I had that woman's faith. Miss
yes.
Betty, God is healing everybody else because of you. You
Boy,
see,
that's a message people need to hear. It
yes.
really is.
And it is you who God sees. You're the martyr of the moment.
Yes, the martyr of the moment.
Don't run away from your being the martyr of the moment.
Yes.
Because
Well, and I'm glad
that's
you
when we
mentioned,
inspire folk.
well,
Mhm.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, you know, we can say not everybody is called to be a Mother Teresa or a Dr. King. The
No.
important thing here is that closeness to God that you talked about, so you know what God wants you to do in that
Amen.
moment.
Preach. Go ahead and preach. But that's exactly right. Whether
Yeah,
you called to do, you weren't called to be Dr. King. You weren't called to be, you may have been called to be one who receives mercy. You may be the one who someone else can find their Christ through your pain.
yes. Because
You know,
as you know, there's a lot of older people that say, My feet, I'm immobile. I can't go out. I can't do
yes,
anything. What am I supposed to do now at my age? And what would your answer be to them?
yes. And what your answer is, and the ones who are sick, they're the ones that say, my gift to you is to allow you to help me.
Yes.
And
Yes.
see, it all works. God's plan works. We have the sick that we minister to, and the sick have to be humble enough to be ministered to.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So getting back to Dr. King then,
Yes.
he was invited to do this because of the sharing of resources. Um, and he was put in jail, and he said, I don't normally even write responses to stuff because my secretaries would spend all day responding to me,
Yes.
which tells you how much criticism this man had, right? I mean, we know
Yes.
that. But the it that letter, and I encourage everybody to go online and read this letter from the Birmingham jail
Yes.
because it lays out so much more than you and I have even talked about. I mean, we picked out a couple things about his law and
Oh,
his moral code, and this idea of um, penetrating the community in which you live, but there's a whole lot more in that
and
letter.
yeah, there's profound wisdom. I have been blessed to be able to have a class on the Birmingham to teach a class on the letter from the
Oh, I
Birmingham
didn't
jail.
know that. Oh,
Yeah. There are a lot of institutions that are beginning to recognize that letter. I would share with you, I believe that in time there will be a class, in history or social studies or civil rights that teaches that class, the letter to a Birmingham jail, because the immensity, the grandeur of it, um, the thought, and to know why he wrote it, because he had to write it in pieces. How did, the connectivity of it, how it flows is all remarkable. I once wrote a letter. Um, I'll share this with you and then I'll send it to you. I received a letter once, and it was signed from a 17-year-old new Catholic who was who had said he was Black, and we had a mass on for Black History Month, and it was very, very Afrocentric
okay.
mass. It was 2 hours. We had dancers and singers, and I mean, it was a beautiful, beautiful celebration of the profound glory of God in His creation. But it was very much Afrocentric. The
Okay.
preaching was was filled with vigor. Um, and the presider was our archbishop, and so I wrote a letter, and I used Dr. King's um, skeleton of his letter as the format through which I wrote mine, in
Oh,
the same method and the same pattern and the same
oh,
pace. And I share that with you because I believe that his letter will soon be, or one day be, the construct for letters responding to those who disagree with our moral or spiritual or position, our civil rights position,
yeah.
because it lays it out so beautifully.
Well,
He does it.
yeah, he does. He lays it out beautifully. He really does. And it could have been a letter filled with hate, but the way he was able to speak his mind, and this is what I think really impacted me, was he could say what he had to say. He could say it honestly. He could say it in a loving way, but he didn't skimp on the truth. I
No,
mean, he
no,
wasn't like, "Oh, gee, I know you guys meant to do well, but he was just like, no,
yeah,
really, this is
you,
the way it is." And that really struck me, that I think a lot of us can gain from that, his
yeah.
approach in the way, like you say, how he laid that out was
Yeah,
incredible.
it's funny, Janet. I came from that letter understanding that we can be brutally honest or lovingly honest,
Yes.
and people will receive being lovingly honest,
Yes.
but the honest part must be there.
Yes. Yes.
And so he was lovingly,
Yes.
beautifully, intellectually, spiritually honest. And so he didn't slap them in the face. He said and acknowledged where they were coming from.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I want to open your eyes to another part that you might be missing. And
Yes.
that's how he did it.
Oh, it was genius.
Yeah.
Do you know,
Yeah.
was this like a line in history books over the years, or was it taught in like public education?
Not in public education, but it is being taught by some teachers as a center on how to approach the civil rights movement and Dr. King.
Okay.
I know there are a couple of organizations, one of which I was on the board, that taught that letter.
Okay.
And it was Dr. King's Nonviolence Center.
Okay.
And there are a number of centers that educate on the civil rights movement who use that letter as the center of Dr. King's movement.
See, I
How it was
knew I knew of the letter, but I don't remember ever. Maybe it's because I was young, but I don't remember ever anybody pulling it apart, studying it, explaining it. drawing wisdom from it. I just knew of the letter, you know.
Sure.
I was
Well,
so removed, I think, from
and that, the whole idea of Black History Month is to begin to introduce people to things that they were never introduced to. I
right.
will share this one thing with you that you are never taught. You probably don't know who Crispus Attucks is.
I think I may have heard the name.
Okay. Yeah, and see, that's the shame, and it's not your fault nor your listeners if they don't know.
Right.
But Crispus Attucks was the first person to die in the Boston Massacre. He was the first person to die for the United States, was this black man.
Huh. Well, that's somebody else I'll have to look up now.
Yeah, which is a remarkable thing. He was enslaved and he ran away. He was half Native American, half African, and he was the first to die when he joined. He wasn't up walking by. He was part of those who were rebelling against the British.
Wow.
So we know uh, who's the guy who rode on the horse.
Oh, Paul
um,
Revere.
yeah, we know who he is, but all he did was ride on a horse. And there's schools and streets and towns and buildings named after him.
Yeah.
What's in the name of Crispus Attucks?
Yeah.
If that's not in our history books, it's
Yes.
no wonder we don't have the letter from a Birmingham jail.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
I have to tell you, as we close here today, once again, I've just thoroughly enjoyed talking with you,
Oh,
and I hope our listeners enjoyed it as well, because it's been wonderful.
well, thank you. Janet, it's always a pleasure. I hope we're able to do this again.
Me too. Me too. Thanks for being with us today.